In the mid-1990s, long before we were all doom scrolling on social media, a different kind of community was gathering. They were listeners of Coast to Coast AM, a late-night radio show that served as a national campfire for the strange, the disturbing, the odd, hosted by Art Bell, who had a style that was inclusive of strange ideas. The show was broadcast from The Fringe, a place where the line between hard reality and entertainment was blurred. Millions tuned in nightly, listening to tales of UFOs, shadow people, and government conspiracy. And they developed a community, participating in the exploration of the unknown. On April 18th, 1995, a voice came through the static from Missouri. It belonged to a man named Mike Marcum, and he would become a legend because of this call. It would be whispered about for decades, and once the internet took hold, he became an internet legend. His claims were crazy. He was trying to build a time machine on his front porch, and his motivation was to get winning lottery tickets from the future. What began as a strange story from a possibly crazy person would spiral into a multi-year saga involving crimes, a dramatic disappearance, and tons of theories that people debate to this day. This is the story of Mike Madman Marcum, the radio time traveler. Let's get spooky. Hey, spooky people, it's your best friend Kenny here, and we are back with another spooky, disturbing story. Before we get to today's story, let's make sure that you are subscribed to this channel, The Spooky Lawyer. Let's make sure that you like and share this video. Share this video by calling into a radio station and telling them to listen to The Spooky Lawyer, if you can get a hold of somebody there. I don't even know. I don't know if you can still call into radio stations, but give it a shot. Mike Marcum was a 20-year-old man living in or near Stanberry, Missouri in 1995. He was born around 1974, and his story begins with a simple, relatable, possibly unconventional method of wanting to become rich. Mike Marcum's background isn't exactly clear. Some say he was an electrical engineering student, which makes his whole time machine idea sound possible that he was attempting to do that. But most people describe him as a tinkerer, someone who taught himself everything and didn't go to college. This idea of a super smart amateur building amazing things from spare parts fits the whole vibe of the story better. It's like he was some sort of natural genius, not tied down to what schools teach. And that makes it a much more interesting story, especially for late night radio and the internet. There's no proof that he ever went to a university, and the stories about him talk about him using whatever he could find in junkyards and garage sales. So the tinkerer story seems to be real. Mike Marcum decided he wanted to build a time machine to get rich by finding future winning lottery numbers. So he began tinkering on his porch, constructing a device known as Jacob's Ladder. This is a classic high voltage physics demonstration, which creates a climbing arc of electricity between two vertical electrodes. And that was Marcum's starting point. You might remember this from high school physics class. His version was built from a bunch of improvised materials, including parts from a microwave oven, transformers, and the laser from a CD player. Mike would tell a story that would make him sound, at least, less like a crazy person and possibly someone who had made a breakthrough in time travel. During one test, Marcum claimed his device produced an unusual visual anomaly, a small circular heat haze effect, a vortex about 8 inches across that looked like ripples of air over the fire. He didn't know what he'd created, so he took a common sheet metal screw and tossed it into the strange field. According to him, he heard a clatter, and the screw had reappeared a few feet away from the device. This incident, which had no evidence or witnesses, became the cornerstone of his claim. This is what convinced him that he was in the middle of a breakthrough in time travel. His screw experiment convinced him that he needed to power and scale up his device. So Marcum got ambitious and a bit cocky, and he decided to commit some crimes. In early 1995, he drove to a power station belonging to St. Joseph Light and Power Company in King City, Missouri, and he stole 6 heavy-duty transformers. These are massive components, each weighing hundreds of pounds. So this was not just a simple act of petty larceny. It was a pretty significant felony. And his attempts to wire these powerful transformers into his homemade apparatus resulted in a massive power surge that caused a blackout across several blocks of his neighborhood. Now, the internet wasn't around then, so people probably weren't as mad about this power outage as they would be today. But still, imagine your neighbor blows up the power grid in your neighborhood. You'd be pretty upset. The blackout quickly alerted the police to what Marcum was up to. As they investigated the power failure, they traced it back to his activities, and he was subsequently arrested for the theft of the transformers. He was convicted and sentenced to 60 days in jail. After serving his jail sentence, Mike Marcum found the perfect platform to share his story. Art Bell's Coast to Coast AM. The show was a cultural phenomenon, a nightly forum where the paranormal and the spooky were treated with genuine curiosity. These people weren't ridiculed, they were supported. Art Bell's genius as a host was his ability to create an atmosphere of open-minded inquiry. He would listen intently, asking good questions that showed he was paying attention, and allowed his guests and callers to tell their stories without interruption or debunking or shaming them. This created a safe space for extraordinary claims, making it the ideal venue for a man who had just been released from prison for stealing electrical equipment to build a time machine. For millions listening in the dark, Bell's show was a theater of the mind, and Markham was able to become its star performer. Markham's appearances on the show unfolded over a series of what are now legendary broadcasts. His first appearance occurred on April 18th, 1995. This date was shortly after his release from jail. Markham called into Coast to Coast AM, and he laid out the entire story for Bell and his national audience. His initial experiments with the Jacob's Ladder, the strange vortex, the disappearing screw, and his subsequent arrest for stealing the Transformers. He concluded his story with a vow to continue his work, but this time he would do it legally. Markham decided to give his phone number out over the air, which was a unique act that transformed the narrative. It was no longer just a one-way broadcast from a host to a passive audience. Suddenly the story became an interactive one, and it became crowdsourced. The phone lines to Markham's home were flooded with calls from listeners across the country. They offered encouragement, technical suggestions, and financial support. The story stopped being Markham's, and it became the entire coast-to-coast communities. His second appearance was in 1996. Markham returned to the show a year later, and his circumstances had changed. Thanks to the donations and support from listeners, his project had grown in scale and sophistication. He told Art Bell that his new, larger machine was now inspired by the infamous Philadelphia experiment, which is a conspiracy theory alleging that the U.S. Navy made a ship invisible using powerful electromagnetic fields. Markham claimed that his device now incorporated a rotating magnetic field and was large enough for a person to enter. He then claimed that he was just 30 days away from completing the machine and testing it on himself. Markham's story unfolding over the radio was modern myth-making, and when he provided his phone number, Markham broke the metaphorical fourth wall between storyteller and audience. He made his listeners direct stakeholders in his narrative, and he allowed them to contribute both in financial and intellectual ways, which transformed them from just passive consumers of a strange story into active participants in an unfolding experiment. The more his audience grew invested, the more the story grew, and the more the story grew, the more invested the audience became. By participating in the story, they wanted the story to be true. He created a community that was literally invested in its outcome. After the 1996 broadcast, where he promised a human trial of his machine, the national audience of Coast to Coast AM waited for an update, but the update never came. In 1997, Mike Marcum went silent. He stopped calling the show, and his whereabouts became a complete mystery. His abrupt disappearance is the suspenseful moment that created the legend. It was like an unresolved cliffhanger from a 90s sitcom that listeners and later internet sleuths would rush to fill with speculations and theories. Without hearing from Mike, myths and folklore started flourishing. The most famous theory about Markham's fate came from another caller on Coast to Coast AM. Sometime after his disappearance, a listener called in to share a story that he had supposedly read in an old newspaper. The story described the discovery of a man's body on a California beach in the 1930s. The body was said to be horribly mangled, crushed inside a strange, futuristic metal tube, and found near the body was a mysterious device that the caller said matched the description of a cell phone. Listeners recall that during the final broadcast, Art Bell had asked Markham what he would take with him on his journey through time, and Mark had replied, "Just my cell phone." The story fit. It provided a dramatic conclusion to the saga. Markham had succeeded, but his machine had malfunctioned, stranding him and killing him in the past. The story lasted on online forums and podcast retellings for over 20 years. But it's pure folklore. There's no verifiable evidence. There's no newspaper articles, police report, or other types of records from the 1930s that substantiate this body that was supposedly found. The mystery of Markham's disappearance became more complicated with claims of his eventual return. Although the story about his reappearance is plagued by inconsistencies, specifically the date. Some claim he resurfaced for an interview on Coast to Coast AM in 2005, stating that he was alive but that his equipment had been destroyed in a fire. Other claims place his return in 2015 on Art Bell's new, short-lived radio program, Midnight in the Desert. Looking into these claims, the 2005 date listed on the Coast to Coast AM website is likely referring to a rebroadcast of his original 1995 interview, which the station often aired as part of its Somewhere in Time series. The evidence that this actually happened is highly debated among the people who are proponents of this theory or fans of this theory. According to the reappearance stories, Markham told an incredible tale. He claimed that he did, in fact, test the machine on himself in 1998. He jumped into the Ark and allegedly woke up in a farm field in Ohio, miles away from civilization. After making his way to a homeless shelter in Cincinnati, he discovered that it was now the year 2000. He had traveled 2 years into the future. When he finally returned to his warehouse in Kansas City, he found it completely empty. All of his equipment, his notes, and every trace of his research had vanished. The narrative is a classic conspiracy. It's convenient, it has the total disappearance of all evidence, and leaves only the storyteller's word as proof. Now, the story to me sounds more like some sort of a psychological break that led to him ending up in a field somewhere, seemingly years in the future. And the fact that his warehouse would not have any of his items in it could, frankly be attributed to the fact that the landlord or the bank or whoever owned or mortgaged the property removed all of his items after he disappeared for years. But a lot of people believe that his reappearance is an entire hoax, or that the entire story was just an elaborate hoax. One of the most compelling arguments for a host comes from a Reddit user who claimed to have listened to the original broadcast. The user claimed that during one of the interviews, Markham let it slip that the time machine story was initially a desperate ploy. Facing felony charges for the Transformer theft, he supposedly concocted a story in hopes that he would be deemed mentally unfit and sent to a psychiatric facility rather than to prison. This is again just an unverified claim from some anonymous source on the internet, but it's a plausible theory for the story's origin. Also supporting the fact that the entire story is a hoax is the lack of any physical evidence. There are no known photographs of Markham's machine, no video recordings of his experiments, no schematics, no blueprints. And despite claims that he received significant funding from listeners and was given a warehouse to work in, not a single one of these alleged backers or witnesses have ever come forward to corroborate his story. Also, there are multiple sources that repeat this story that after his reappearance, Markham moved to Hawaii and in 2016 started a GoFundMe campaign to raise money for his continued experiments. However, if you search the GoFundMe platform, you cannot find such a campaign. The only fundraisers associated with the name Mike Marcum are clearly unrelated. So, again, a massive lack of evidence. Another issue is the fact that Markham's claims are scientifically impossible. His chosen technology, which is the Jacob's Ladder, is again a standard high school physics demonstration of high voltage electrical arc climbing through the air as it heats the surrounding plasma. There are no known or theoretical connections to time travel or creating temporal vortexes. It's a visual experiment, not a gateway through time. Another issue with the science of his experiment is the problem of spatial displacement. As you know, the Earth is not stationary. It rotates on an axis and it orbits the sun. And it moves through the solar system, through the galaxy at high speeds. A time jump of even a single second would require a simultaneous spatial jump of hundreds of miles to land in the same spot on the planet's surface. Any time machine that did not account for this would deposit its traveler into the vacuum of space or deep within the Earth's crust. According to some accounts, Markham addressed this by claiming his machine had a gravitational lock to the Earth, a convenient but completely meaningless phrase that serves as a patch to cover this fatal flaw in his theory. There's a big difference between the 1995-1997 story arc and the later claims of his reappearance. The first part, the 1995 to 1997 story, is tight, compelling, and it has a self-contained mystery. The second part of the story is weak and contradictory. It has cliches and lack of evidence. The initial story grew organically from a blend of fact and a perfectly timed disappearance, creating a genuine mystery. The reappearance story feels more like a deliberate attempt at storytelling, designed to provide answers that only create more plot holes. It's like a bad sequel to a horror movie. The story of Mike Marcum is a fascinating story, and it's clear that Mike Marcum was a real person who in 1995 was arrested in jail for stealing 6 power transformers in Missouri. He made significant claims that he was building and had built a functional time machine and had intended to travel through time. After that, it's completely unclear what happened to him. And instead of truth and verifiable facts, myth-making and folklore has filled in those details. But ultimately, the question of whether Mike Marcum actually traveled through time is not the most important part of the story. The fascinating part is the narrative itself. A story about a desire to believe, the seductive power of the unknown, and the living process through which a good story, anchored by a single bit of truth, can turn into a modern myth. Mike Marcum may have vanished, but his story has stayed with us and holds an incredible place in our collective imagination. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel, The Spooky Lawyer. Make sure that you like and share this video. Follow me on Twitter Blue Sky, and TikTok. My username is TheSpookyLawyer. If there is a spooky or disturbing story you would like me to cover, leave a comment. Or if you like the video, leave a comment. I read all my comments and I respond to most of my comments. Or if you're feeling shy, send me an email. My email address is thespookylawyer@gmail.com. If you would like to support the channel, there is a link in the description where you can buy me a coffee. So buy me a coffee. Or you can become a member of the channel. The first tier of my channel's membership is $1.99 a month. And you can get exclusive content, including exclusive videos that are for just members. Thank you. I would appreciate it. I'm going to put the names of all the people who have donated to my channel here. Thank you very much. You also support me by continuing to like, share, and watch my videos. And it truly means a lot to me that you watch my videos. And please stay spooky.